Hi guys, today we're going to start into chapter 9, which is all about genetics. And I was trying to push this chapter off till later, hoping that we'd go back to school because this is one of my favorite chapters, but since we're not, we'll just go ahead and work with what we've got. So we're starting off talking about Gregor Mendel, and he was the father of genetics, and he did all these studies with pea plants, which is how we ended up finding out how you inherit your traits. So it started at the age of 21. In 1843, he joined a monastery in Austria, which is where monks live. And there's not a whole lot to do in monasteries. They don't have TVs, you're not going to go out and hang out with your friends. There was cleaning jobs and gardening jobs. So he probably got one of the better jobs because at least you got to be outside. In 1851, he went to the University of Vienna and he studied science and math. And with that knowledge, he decided to do some research in heredity, which is the transfer of characteristics from parents to offspring. Then, whenever he returned to his monastery after his college stint, he ended up working with pea plants. He observed that they had 7 different characteristics, and each characteristic has 2 different traits. Now, a trait is a genetically determined variant of a characteristic. So, for example, a characteristic would be the color of the pea plant, and the 2 traits would be green or yellow. So there's our green pea plant and our yellow pea plant. So what's the difference in traits of these 2 pea plants? Well, the characteristic would be the texture of the seed, and the 2 traits would be either round or wrinkled. So these are the following traits that he observed. He looked at plant height, it could be long or short, flower position along the stem, pod color, seed texture, seed color, flower color, and the pod appearance. He was able to see how these traits were passed from one generation to the next by controlling how the pea plants were pollinated. And you've probably seen pollination occurring outside if you've been taking any walks. It's where pollen grains are transferred from the male part of the reproductive plant to the female part of the reproductive plant. So the male part of the plant is going to be the anther, which is these little red things here, and the stigma is the female part. The anther has the pollen, so the pollen is going to leave the anther and go up to the stigma, and that's how you're going to end up with pea plants or fruit, various things like that. There's different ways that plants can go through pollination. The first one is self-pollination, where a plant is essentially going to be pollinating itself. So it's using its own pollen from its own anthers to go onto the stamen. And the other way, which is the most common way that the majority of plants do it, is through cross-pollination. And this is where you have 2 different flowers, and they're basically pollinating each other. Normally, they're going to use some type of a pollinator like a bee or other insect. So it takes the pollen from one plant, delivers it to the other plant. Mendel wanted to control how his plants were pollinating. So he forced cross-pollination to occur by plucking out, which would be very, very tedious, plucking out all the anthers from the flowers of each plant. And by doing this, he was able to transfer the pollen to which plants he wanted it to go to. He originally studied each characteristic and its contrasting traits individually, and he began growing plants that were true breeding for each trait. Now, true breeding is basically like a purebred. So it's plants that are pure for a trait, and they'll always produce offspring with that trait when they self-pollinate. So think about, racing dogs or Dalmatians, purebred beagles. You only breed them with other beagles because you know that you're going to get a baby beagle. Or if a greyhound dog is really good at running, you're going to breed it with another dog that's really good at running, hoping that you end up with a baby dog that is really good at running. So his example with his pea plants, he said that they were true breeding for green pods because whenever they self-pollinate, they will always produce green pods. You're not going to get a yellow pod from a true breeding green pea podded plant. So here we have some green pea pods just to give you an example of what that would look like. If you ever played Plants vs. Zombies, which I used to play before it got too crazy with upgrading your plants, they were all true breeding plants. They were always green. You never ended up with a different colored pea pod from one of these plants. So Mendel crossed plants that were true breeding for contrasting traits of a single characteristic. He called this true breeding parents the pea generation. So P stood for parents. So he had purple flowers and he had his white flowers. And he took each of these parents and he crossed them. When he did this, he called the first kid generation the F1 generation. So he had his purple parent, his white parent, he crossed them, and all of the children ended up having purple flowers. So he then allowed the F1 generation to self-pollinate. So he didn't pluck the anthers out, he just let the pollen go where it wanted. And he called this offspring the second female generation, or the F2 generation. Anytime you have more kids after that, it'd be F3, F4, and so on and what have you. So we have our parents up here. One parent's purple, one parent's white. He crossed them. All the children had purple flowers. This generation here went through self-pollination. And when that happened, he ended up with a lot of purple kids, but he also got some white children as well. So that white characteristic ended up coming back. And he did this with a ton of plants. He had 705 purple flowered plants to 224 white flowered plants. So he found this uneven distribution in the number of each characteristic for a certain trait. So roughly for every 3 purple flowers, there was 1 white flower. So he had a 3-to-1 ratio. And as he kept on repeating these experiments over and over again, it led him to hypothesize that some characteristics within the pea plants controlled the characteristics that he was observing. So when Mendel crossed the plants and one of the pea traits failed to appear in the F1 generation, that white trait just up and disappeared. But it always reappeared in the F2 generation. So he said that the trait appearing in the F1 generation was controlled by a dominant factor because it masked the factor that was not seen, and the trait that was not appearing in the F1 generation was going to be recessive. So looking here, the purple trait would be dominant, the white trait would be recessive. Mendel concluded that the paired factors separated during the formation of the reproductive cells. So if you remember back to chapter 8 with meiosis, that's where you get your egg cells and your sperm cells. Each offspring flower received 1 factor from each of the pair parental flowers, which led to the law of segregation stating that a pair of factors is separated during the formation of the gametes. So here you have your purple parent and your white parent. They were true breeding. So we have capital P's here, lowercase p's here. When they were cross-pollinated, the children ended up being purple. You had 1 capital P from the purple guy, 1 lowercase p from the white guy. Mendel noticed that the green plants had white flowers and other green plants had purple flowers. So this led him to believe that the factors for individual characteristics were not connected to one another, meaning that a green plant could have white flowers or purple flowers. The plant color did not have to change in order to give you different colored flowers. And this is how he came up with the law of independent assortment, which states that factors separate independently of one another during the formation of the gametes. So here we're going to use human traits for a second. And when we're saying that they can separate independently, we're looking at eye color and hair color. So you could have brown eyes and black hair, blue eyes and red hair, brown eyes and red hair, or blue eyes and black hair. We're saying that hair color is not linked to your eye color, so they're 2 separate things. Molecular genetics is the study of structure and function of chromosomes and genes. And if you remember back to talking a little bit about DNA, a gene is just 1 segment of DNA on a chromosome that controls a particular trait. So because chromosomes occur in pairs, genes also occur in pairs. So here we have just a picture of a chromosome, and each chromosome has many different genes on it. We're going to say that here's where the flower color would be located. So the allele for purple flowers and the allele for white flowers. These are homologous chromosomes, meaning that they have the same traits or same genes. Each of the 2 forms of a gene is called an allele, and any characteristic that Mendel observed was made up of 2 different alleles. We use capital letters to represent dominant alleles, and we use lowercase letters to represent recessive alleles. During meiosis, gametes receive an allele from each parent for any particular trait. So we have parent 1, they have allele A and allele B. Parent 2 also has allele A and B, and they're going to be giving one of these 2 alleles to the child. So the child is going to inherit allele A from parent 1 and allele B from parent 2, and it just depends on which one is dominant as to which one will show up. And that is where we are going to stop for this week.